Have you ever heard of BC's Land Act? Many Canadians and British Columbians have not, and even more have not heard about the sweeping changes being proposed by the province's NDP government. Changes that can affect how British Columbians are able to use public Crown land, whether that be to enjoy fishing on a lake, or to go skiing with the family, or even to do business in certain lands. Now, armed with the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, commonly referred to as UNDRIP, or properly abbreviated to DRIPA after its passing, the BC NDP government is proposing handing over joint decision and authority to First Nations who are unelected to decide how such lands can be managed. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News, and joining me today is the leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia, John Rustad, who formerly served as the province's Minister of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation. Rustad's going to share the other side of the story of what could happen, including how this may actually be a step backwards for British Columbians and reconciliation. You're going to want to watch this report and share it so people know.
But I will certainly take this occasion to encourage provincial governments, and a number of them already have, to have real conversations on the path forward in partnership with Indigenous peoples, just like the federal government is doing in areas of our jurisdiction.
Leader of the Conservative Party, John Rustad, also the MLA for Nechako Lakes. Thanks for catching up with me real quick. I know you're really busy. You're in the Lower Mainland for one day, but this was such an important topic. And plus, you have skin in the game when it comes to reconciliation for First Nations. So thanks for being on Rebel News.
My pleasure. Thanks for actually having me. This is such an important issue to be talking about.
Now, so for those who are not familiar, I did mention that you actually, more than any other leader in modern Canadian history, have signed a lot of agreements. Tell us a little bit about that.
So when I was Minister for Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation, I signed 435 agreements. We had a great team of people that did negotiations, but what it was it's all about trying to create economic reconciliation, agreements that had First Nations engaging in the economy, engaging in what was going on in the landscape, even engaging in things like healthcare. So it was very important in terms of advancing reconciliation in British Columbia in terms of how we shape these agreements.
And now you and your party are speaking out against the sweeping changes that the NDP government is proposing quite secretly. There was no public announcement at all, and I think only stakeholders were informed, like Bell and Rogers. So let's begin with just briefly, what is BC's Land Act? What was it intended for? And what do you think is happening now? How's it being used?
Well, we actually don't know exactly what it is that the NDP are going to do because, of course, they haven't brought the legislation in. They won't bring it in until likely April. But what we're hearing from this, when we were in government, we had what was called shared decision making. We would sit down with First Nations, we would talk about how things are going to work on the landscape, we'd get their input, and so that would either bring about changes or sometimes things didn't advance. But ultimately, the Crown was responsible for making the decision on Crown land. And what the NDP are talking about doing is doing what they call joint decision making. So both the First Nations and the Crown will make decisions. Essentially what that means, if a First Nation decides they don't want something to go forward, even though it might be in the public interest, the Crown cannot advance because it requires both sides to be able to agree. Where this gets really complex is where you have overlapping First Nations that may not agree, because now you need to get all of the First Nations to agree on a project going forward. And you can imagine whether it's a mine or whether it's forestry activity or whether it's anything else significant on the landscape, you need a lot of expertise. You need a lot of people like engineers and biologists and foresters and a wide range of professionals that would be providing the input to government to be able to make a decision. Well, now each of the 204 nations in the province are also going to have these same skill sets and have to have these same experts. And so the time it's going to take is going to be very, very brutal, quite frankly. And the ability to actually move anything forward is going to come to a halt. And so we really need to be thinking about this again from this is Canada, this is British Columbia, that's the Crown's responsibility to manage Crown land. And it is also the Crown's responsibility to engage with First Nations, to be able to address their Section 35 rights, which includes title, to be able to work through that and accommodate where there are impacts, but ultimately it's the decision that the Crown needs to make.
And not only that, we're talking about, I think there's about 205 First Nations, and that is a minority when you look at British Columbians as a whole. And so there's that thought of what would happen if there's these sort of unelected people coming together to make decisions about where you can ski or how you can access land. What would that look like? Tell us a little bit about that, like how people might be affected if things. Is there a veto of sorts happening here?
What will happen, what is essentially happening now under UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, is already a veto because the government will not move forward anything unless they have consensus. So now what they're doing is they're codifying that, bringing it in terms of joint decision making so that basically nothing can move, nothing can happen on the landscape, hunting decisions, recreational decisions, resource decisions, nothing will be able to happen unless you now have the approval through the First Nation process. And so it opens up, quite frankly, I hate to say this, but it opens up for potential for corruption, as people trying to make deals now to try to get approval through this process. It's not, quite frankly, I think the right way we should be managing our landscape, which is why I'm opposed to what they're doing with this joint decision making. But it's also when I look at the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, we're seeing that now really clogging the system, not being able to get permits through, and it's creating many divisions. Reconciliation should be about bringing people together, not creating divisions, which is why we're now actually opposed to the United Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People as well.
That's right. I noticed that your conservative competitors, the BC United, they're also speaking out about these proposed changes to the Land Act. But it seems your party is the only one saying, hey, we need to halt UNDRIP, or I think it's now called DRIPA as well. So I guess what would you say to people who look at you say that and go, whoa, 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 you're trying to call a stop to everything that might work in favor of reconciliation for First Nations?
Well, this is the problem. The UNDRIP, or DRIPA as it's called, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, is actually creating those divisions. It's not creating reconciliation. And when I was a minister, like I say, I signed 435 agreements with First Nations, which was all about reconciliation. We need to be looking beyond what we're currently doing because this is not good for the people of British Columbia, and quite frankly, it's not helping with reconciliation. We actually need to look at economic reconciliation, getting First Nations more engaged directly with the economy, not transferring economy from one people to another, but adding to our economy, creating the opportunity for investment, creating the opportunity that can really make a difference. And I'll give you the example, and I've used this many times in speeches, but the Haisla First Nation, which went down this path, they were a nation that had 65% plus unemployment. They had all the social issues that every other First Nation has, most other First Nations have. And they engaged in the economy. They engaged, we did some agreements, we transferred some land. It created an opportunity for them. So now they're at 15% or less unemployment. The social issues have gone away. People are out buying cars, they're buying trucks, they're buying homes, they're taking vacations, they've engaged, but it's not just about the First Nation, it's the whole province that's benefiting from doing this, and especially in that region. And that's what we want to be able to see happen for all First Nations in British Columbia.
But some might look at this and say, well, you were part of the government, like everybody else, who supported UNDRIP, and so how do you sort of reconcile that?
So when I was in opposition, or as opposition, when the NDP brought in UNDRIP and brought in these processes that are creating all these challenges, I was forced by my party, by the BC Liberal Party, to actually vote in favor of this act. Now, they don't allow for free votes, so I didn't have a choice. But I did speak out in favor of this act as well, because most of UNDRIP is motherhood and apple pies. It's fine. It's actually the great things that we should be doing in terms of reconciliation, supporting culture, supporting understanding and engaging with Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. There's just a number of clauses in there that are really problematic, and they weren't written for thinking about Canada with our Constitution or thinking about what we consider as traditional territory. It was written for what's going on in many other places in the world. And so right now what this essentially those pieces will do, and I warned government at the time about those pieces in UNDRIP. That's what's creating this division. That's what's creating this need for consensus to make decisions on the landscape. That's what is causing all of the problems. And government is now doubling down on that and going further with the joint decision making. So yes, I voted in favor of it because I like reconciliation. That's exactly why, as minister, I did all those agreements and moved forward with First Nations. But this has now gotten to a place where it's actually now creating divisions, not creating what we'd like to see, which is bringing people together. One of the things that's most important to think is if you're going to be, opposing something like UNDRIP, what are you going to be doing? And that's something that is very important to be thinking about. So what we are going to be looking at doing is economic reconciliation. We're going to be looking at taking land that makes sense in terms of returning land to First Nations, where it will engage economic opportunities for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, to allow for that really, full engagement. It was Dr. Joseph Gosnell, who was the, sort of the lead architect of the Nisga'a Treaty, that once said it's long past time for First Nations not only to be able to catch up economically, but if possible surpass. And I believe that's exactly where we need to go. We've got this symbiotic relationship. We need to have First Nations engaged, having those opportunities to be able to prosper, moving away from managing poverty to being able to manage success, and so that Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike can advance, and we can open up this province for investment and for opportunity, particularly for the revenues that we need for all those other services that are important.
Well, there you have it. Leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia, John Rustad, and his take on the proposed sweeping changes, it may seem, to BC's Land Act. Drea Humphrey for Rebel News.
Thank you, Drea.
2024 is general election year for British Columbia, and as Rebel News' BC chief reporter of this province, I'm going to bring you reports you can trust on the campaign trail. To stay in the know and get our emails and to help chip in a few bucks to keep our coverage going strong, go to bcleadershipreports.com. We appreciate your support.